I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. My topic today is Meryl and Malone, a fig leaf for Mr. I Don't Tuck. And for those who don't get the reference, this is Meryl Nass and Robert Malone, who infamously said, when asked about dropping the lawsuit against the Bregans, there comes a time when you have to decide whether to tuck your tail and run, and needless to say, I don't tuck. That phrase makes me barf a little in my mouth every time I say it. Now that his suit has been thrown out by the judge and he may be potentially hit with a slap suit for a frivolous case, maybe he wishes he did tuck. I haven't been on the Malone watch lately, but fortunately others have. Charles Wright put out an interesting piece on the WHO and Malone and his statements that intelligence, the CIA, started the WHO, and that if someone hadn't, we'd need to invent it because you need that kind of centralization at a global level in order to handle things like pandemics. So I think the mask is off for anyone who thought that he was operating on the side of sovereignty. Meryl Nass came up in a comment thread on Matthew Crawford's article where he talks again about the DMED data and the importance of that and what kind of difference it would have made if that had been entered into the congressional record rather than him being thwarted by Kirsch and Malone. In the comments, Laura Garcia mentioned that she had had a conversation with Meryl about Malone, and I said that I had saved a comment thread that I had with her, again looking at whether Malone was on the up and up. And then someone named Sarah Woods Kinder said that she would be very interested in that because she believes that Meryl Nass is completely legit. So I'm going to be presenting that, and I'm going to be looking at how it represents the overall strategy of controlled opposition and something that I think is bigger than just that one example. But first, because I know people come to my stack sometimes for one topic but not another, I wanted to talk about why it is that I always am giving the exact same message but just in a different vocabulary. And that message is, all people are inherently good, and when they behave badly, systems or stories are to blame. We've been looking at, on Charles Eisenstein's stack, some very bad behavior by the IDF these days. And these are young kids that are acting in ways that are just going to cause them a lifetime of recrimination and guilt if they get to that point. So when I look at those young kids, I think that they've been manipulated by two different levels of stories. One of those stories is the Torah, and looking at the fact that it says some people are animals, some people are born to be slaves, some people don't have a soul. And that's one level of the lie that makes them act in a certain way. The second level is the history of the world wars. And when I go back and look at those, what I'm saying is the Germans were not monsters, and that it wasn't like there was the good guys with Churchill and FDR on one side and then Hitler and the Nazis on the other. That wasn't how things worked. And when good people behaved badly, like what was done to the Germans by the U.S. soldiers and also the Soviet soldiers, it was because they had been told a story about Germans being inhuman. So when I look at different topics like economics, I'll be looking at how systems cause people to behave badly. When I've looked at the topic of tonic versus toxic masculinity, I've been challenging the habits of patriarchal thinking and how we have that hierarchy built into the way that we look at problems. And when I look at mysticism, I'm looking again at the idea that there are ancient and contemporary scriptures that say all people are good, all people are equal. We're not good people and bad people. So no matter which vocabulary I'm using, that's always the message. In the last 3 years, we've been subjected to the greatest push in the history of the world for a small group who believes themselves better than us to take control of the entire globe. And that is being done through systems which they own, whether that is healthcare or media or economics or whatever, but also it's being done through stories. And in order to get those stories out, they need credible people. They need people who have bought into them and who we trust. So those are the people that are actually doing more damage, are more dangerous than those who know that it's a ruse, because they can't convince us, the people who know they're lying. The people who don't know they're lying, who have bought in, are what I call the naive do-gooders. And that's why we need to critique and hold people to being honest about these stories and challenge the stories. It's not criticizing the person for their intentions, which are probably good. But if they're holding on to a story that is damaging, then we need to be challenging that story. Someone doing a great job of this is Alison MacDowell, who I've been listening to lately. She does Wrench in the Gears, and she has something called Camelot Corner, where she looks at, one I heard today was about Scientology and the children's health defense, particularly in California. She ties together a lot of different threads and is looking at Charles Eisenstein and his role with RFK. Children's health defense is a huge net that has mentored and given people exposure, and that exposure comes at some price of saying, you don't bite the hand that feeds you. This is my friends. This is someone I believe to be sincere. And so the stories, like RFK on Israel, don't end up being challenged because those are the people who have been our supporters and our friends. This was my first comment to Meryl. I believe the question George Webb wanted to ask Malone was why he hadn't tested hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin for efficacy against COVID back in April 2020, when the company for which he was chief medical officer had the $21 million contract from the Trump administration. If he had and found either effective, there would have been no emergency use authorization, and therefore no vaccine injuries and possibly few COVID deaths. Instead, he tested famotidine, Pepcid AC, with hydroxychloroquine against hydroxychloroquine alone and concluded there was no significant improvement. Of course, since hydroxychloroquine was already effective, hence the emergency use authorization. Maybe I have my facts wrong, but I think that's what George Webb wanted to ask. And then Meryl replied, I can answer your question, which is based on misunderstanding the facts. 1. Robert Malone worked on modeling to identify drugs that might work against COVID. Many drugs were identified, and they included ivermectin. However, ivermectin did not look to be as good a match as some other drugs, including Celebrex and Pepcid. In Malone's attempts to get FDA approval for a clinical trial for the DoD, I was told about this in 2021, by the way, ivermectin was included as a drug to be tested in the human trial. FDA would have none of it, so ivermectin had to be removed from the drugs tested in order to get the trial approved, which took forever anyway. Everyone who says there would have been no emergency use authorization issued for the vaccines was not reading my work in 2020, apparently. I made very clear what the PrEP Act required, that there be no adequate, available, approved substitute therapeutic. We knew before the vaccines were authorized under PrEP that hydroxychloroquine acted acutely against the COVID virus and behaved like a vaccine to prevent COVID when taken properly. We knew in January or February 2021 that ivermectin could do this too. There were plenty of studies detailed by me, Tess Lawrie, Pierre Corey, many others showing this. Citizens Health Defense filed a citizen petition and later filed suit against the FDA, pointing this out very explicitly. I helped write it. FDA denied us. The globalist crooks were not going to let anything stand in the way of their vaccine emergency use authorization, and anyone who says otherwise was not paying attention. The FDA had their marching orders and they followed them. Malone still says the combo of Pepcid and Celebrex is very effective. Have the emergency use authorizations gone away ever? FDA says even after May 11th, those emergency use authorizations will continue. I'm going to post my chapter in Malone's book, which lays out how the NIAID showed over 60 drugs were effective for deadly coronaviruses in 2014. That should have ended any emergency use authorization. It didn't. I answered, "Thank you for explaining that, Meryl, and for posting your chapter. It's a very inspiring story. I am truly trying to understand and most of all, do my small part to make sure this can never happen again." To answer Jackie's question, I think that it's a natural thing to look at someone's background when it's in conflict with their current role and try to put the pieces together. I was just reading Robert's 2 articles on reforming the HHS, and they're brilliant, so I'm not looking at this as black and white. But there are things that don't make sense to me. From Brandon Burrell, the money to do the trials came from BARDA, and it was Robert's domain system that identified the likely candidates to be tested. But he says that Trump had made hydroxychloroquine the standard of care, so he could only test famotidine with and without hydroxychloroquine. Couldn't hydroxychloroquine have been shown to be effective on its own? It seems like that wouldn't have required more funding than the $21 million and might have been tested pre-admission, since the Trump admin was on board with it. Did the domain system not identify ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine? Thanks again for clarifying. Meryl replied, "I don't know the names of projects. I think some of the group that did the early modeling of repurposed drugs did it without payment. I do not know about $21 million contracts and what they may have been for. What I can tell you is that as a consultant, Robert was paid by the hour, day, or week, and never received a percentage of what he brought in as a grant or contract. I understand that it works differently in banking and law, but not in medical science contracting. At least it did not for him and not for others I know. Trump cannot and did not make hydroxychloroquine a standard of care. As soon as Trump opined about hydroxychloroquine, gift from God, etc., immediately the media and most states put restrictions on its use, beginning around March 20th, 2020. His HHS worked against him. The Chinese already had about 20 hydroxychloroquine trials going by March, and told us in February 2020 it was their best drug. Soon, the COVID-19study.com website appeared, which listed all clinical trials published and pre-printed for hydroxychloroquine and other possible COVID drugs. On May 22nd, the fabricated Lancet paper claimed hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine were causing about 30% more deaths than usual care in 15,000 people hospitalized around the world. Beginning in March 2020, at least 3 overdose trials started to kill off hydroxychloroquine as a viable strategy. The Brazil trial, Recovery, and Solidarity. Do you really think the FDA was going to allow human trials of hydroxychloroquine in any manner that would show it worked? In May, NIAID began finally an outpatient trial of hydroxychloroquine, and NIAID shut it down after only 20 patients were enrolled to prevent positive data from appearing. Anyone who thinks Malone's omissions had anything to do with the suppression of hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin is either ignorant of the facts or is a confabulator. The entire U.S. public health system, and this happened around the world, the WHO was involved too, was bound and determined to prevent the drug from being used or appreciated. You didn't need any more trials. There were plenty to show it worked, and they were mischaracterized, hidden, and buried with fake trial designed to kill off those drugs. Lots of docs like me were using the drug early because we read the literature. My first hydroxychloroquine treatment was in mid-March 2020. Most of the early trials had no funding, were done by docs just trying the drugs out. I wrote back to Meryl, "Thanks again. It seems like we might be talking about different things." From Science, April 2020 by Brendan Burrell. After Callahan returned from Wuhan, he briefed Robert Cadlick, Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at the Department of Health and Human Services, then checked in with Robert Malone, Chief Medical Officer of Florida-based Alchem Labs, a contract manufacturing organization. Malone is part of a classified project called Domain that uses computer simulations, artificial intelligence, and other methods to rapidly identify U.S. FDA-approved drugs and other safe compounds that can be repurposed against threats such as new viruses. On the 14th of April, the U.S. BARDA, which operates under Cadlick, gave Alchem a $20.7 million contract for the trial, most of which paid Northwell's cost. The study's draft protocol was aimed only at evaluating famotidin's efficacy, but Trump's game-changer anti-malarial drug was rapidly becoming the standard of care for hospitalized COVID-19 patients. That meant investigators would only be able to recruit enough subjects for a trial that tested a combination of famotidine and hydroxychloroquine. Those patients would be compared with a hydroxychloroquine-only arm and a historic control arm made up of hundreds of patients treated earlier in the outbreak. So it was Robert's company, Alchem, that got the $20.7 million, but they were collecting data on hydroxychloroquine, whether in combination with famotidine or alone. And they were working for BARDA, not on their own. It seems like that should have been able to show that hydroxychloroquine worked and defeat the EUA. Does that make sense? Meryl replied, "According to my understanding from Jill Malone, the Northwell trial was either designed to fail or was a mess in some other way, and Robert separated from it very early on and soon left Alchem. If you would read the massive amount of stuff I just posted about the evidence on hydroxychloroquine from the first 7 months of 2020, you would realize you're beating a dead horse. Your insistence that Robert Malone would have prevented the EUA when nothing else did is, I'm sorry, preposterous. Fantasy. I just posted about much available evidence in early 2020, and none of it stopped the EUA. I'm stupefied that anyone who looks at the facts could come up with this theory. Sorry, Teresa, but it is crazy." I answered, "Yes, I agree with Jill that this trial was certainly designed to fail. It tested famotidine plus hydroxychloroquine against hydroxychloroquine alone. So if hydroxychloroquine was effective, it would negate any incremental effect of famotidine. But Robert would have been able to reach his own conclusions just from looking at the data that hydroxychloroquine was working. Has he talked about why his domain system didn't come up with hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin? Does he still believe it's an effective modeling program? I'm sorry you feel I'm crazy, Meryl, but these seem like reasonable questions. No one else involved in this movement that I'm aware of had a close working relationship with BARDA, so much that he helped Steve get his product approved by them in their first serious interaction, and that's Steve Kirsch. I don't know that he could have stopped the EUA, but as the company with the tool for identifying repurposed drugs for BARDA, it seems like he'd be in the best position to. Robert worked closely with Fauci, and for the first 8 months, Fauci answered to Trump, who was a believer in hydroxychloroquine. It seems like that could have been leveraged by someone with Robert's connections, who can get on a Zoom conference with Pelosi or meet with the FDA's head of bioethics, who asked Robert for professional favors. Has he ever told you what went on during that time? Meryl replied, I don't think you are reading what I write. I already told you that ivermectin did show up in his modeling. Whether it was domain or some other name, I told you I do not know. He did try to test ivermectin in one trial, and FDA refused to approve the trial till ivermectin was removed. I wrote that already. If, by answering to Trump, you think Fauci was doing Trump's bidding and not working behind his back to overrule him, I have a bridge to sell you. Please try reading what I have reposted tonight, which should disabuse you of any of these fabulous speculations that you, the Bregans, and others have latched onto, but are illogical at best and a psyop otherwise. Loads of people were A, trying to get hydroxychloroquine used on a mass scale, and B, trying to stop the vaccine EUAs. But both were crucial to taking over the world. If there was no more pandemic, there would be no reason for vaccines, passports, CBDCs, lockdowns, small business failures, etc. I believe you to be capable of understanding these simple facts. So I am perplexed why you persist. And I am considering no longer replying to comments that ignore my previous posts and answers. I am convinced that his effectiveness, Malone's, has led to a huge expenditure of resources to discredit him, mixing some facts with some fiction so that it sounds believable. It even confuses my friends. The problem is that so few people were paying close enough attention or knew the actual facts to be able to untangle these false stories. When I can, I do so, and I now realize I am going to have to do a lot more of this because it just won't stop. The globalists want us to fight each other, and they want to eliminate him. I think they are also especially going after him because he was an insider who turned. They don't want any other insiders considering the same thing. And they have crafted very detailed stories and keep recycling them. George Webb should know better, but finally, when you stir up controversy, you get more hits on Substack and more paid subscribers. It might be a powerful incentive to keep stirring the pot. I answered that, just as an aside, I've never enabled paid subscriptions on my Substack. I'm a housewife with 3 daughters who spent a decade writing my book on how to dismantle an empire, which I self-published. You know, Meryl, that I was one of Robert's most enthusiastic supporters until he sued the Bregans, and because I always look at both sides, I read theirs. On one side of that equation is a couple who made millions working with the DoD, with Big Pharma and the WHO and philanthropaths, all of which were on his CV. And on the other is a couple who've had attacks on them for testifying against pharmaceutical companies to stop electroshock and suicide-inducing antidepressants. There's not a neutral side to be on here. Are you really saying that the Bregans, who wrote COVID-19 and the Global Predators, We Are the Prey, are secretly on the side of the globalists? or that anyone who's on their side must be in the pay of the WEF and their book telling exactly how we can decentralize and end the empire is just a clever ruse. Meryl answered, "What I am saying is that as a smart lady, you have shown the ability to be logical, but are not using that ability. I think the Bregans are on the side of the Bregans. I think the Malones are on the side of the Malones. I suspect the Bregans feel they deserve the accolades the Malones have received, almost like sibling rivalry. Best way I can make sense of it. With regards to money, I would guess that each earned a solid upper middle class amount, since Bregan has done a lot of very lucrative expert witnessing. The Malones did not make millions, but perhaps their farm is worth $1 million. They are not wealthy, and they work hard, caring for a horse farm and gardens and fruit trees on top of everything else. They gave up their life for this movement in a way very few others have done. They have no consulting career to go back to. They probably live off Substack. Their future is uncertain. The jealousy is unfounded. And these speculations give the fifth-generation warriors fertile ground to create rumors, innuendo, and try to destroy him. If you want to be a truth warrior, you chase down the facts and you use discernment regarding who you listen to." And I'll end with a comment from Ricky Rants. Prior to COVID, Malone pushed vaccine contracts all over the world, and many of them were likely linked to bioweapons. He's pretending to be anti-vax now, possibly because Ditra or certain companies didn't get the contracts they wanted, I guess. If Inovio got a COVID shot approved, Malone wouldn't be playing a dissenter. As recently as September 2021, Malone was pushing a multivalent vaccine out of India and suggested getting it to as many people as possible in the global south. How can you allegedly get COVID at the second known superspreader event, cure yourself, then get the mRNA shots, then get injured, and then go promote a vaccine in India? Is this man's trajectory even remotely believable? It's time to stop pretending this is infighting and start asking people tough questions. Heroes don't sue heroes for $25 million. In this conversation, it seems to me that Meryl uses obfuscation. She puts in a lot of irrelevant details and then says, "Oh, I don't know about those," when I mention details that I've already cited from published sources. It seems like she is making character attacks and saying that I don't know how to think clearly, rather than addressing the question that Robert Malone was in a unique position because he was reporting to BARDA and doing work for them on identifying repurposed drugs. So that doesn't make him just another doctor who's out there doing their own studies and trying to get the emergency use authorization revoked. That gives him a position of power that he did not use. Whether Meryl is lying to herself or whether she's lying to us as controlled opposition, I don't think really matters. To me, what matters is that she has been captured, and that's what controlled opposition does. It brings as many people as possible who are credible in under that umbrella and makes them beholden to their sponsors. So I, for myself, have decided that I just can't learn anything more from people who are unable to look at facts and be able to draw conclusions. I'm not saying that they're bad people, they're just not someone that I feel like I can learn from. For more on the 18 now videos that I've done on Malone, here is Black Pill Hatfill and Malone, where I think he really takes off the mask. And this is Malone and Slaughterhouse 4 with 6 tells for whether someone's controlled opposition. Thank you for watching.